It was supposed to be a routine segment on a popular morning talk show, a mix of celebrity commentary and political discussion wrapped in polished smiles and predictable questions. Whoopi Goldberg, a long-standing host known for her strong opinions, sat center stage with her usual air of casual dominance. That morning's guest, however, was not one to fold under pressure. Karoline Leavitt, former press secretary and rising political commentator, was booked as part of a segment intended to discuss generational politics and the role of youth in reshaping the conservative movement. But no one on the production team could have predicted just how quickly things would unravel. From the moment Karoline walked onto the set, the atmosphere shifted. She carried herself with quiet confidence, unfazed by the legacy of the show or the towering personality sitting across from her. Whoopi, on the other hand, appeared dismissive even before the segment began, barely acknowledging her guest as cameras rolled. The tension built quietly at first, masked by shallow pleasantries and surface-level banter. But within minutes, the topic turned toward recent conservative movements and what Whoopi referred to as the reckless direction of younger political voices. Karoline didn't hesitate to respond, her tone cutting and deliberate. She dismantled Whoopi's generalizations one by one, pointing out the hypocrisy in dismissing an entire generation while simultaneously claiming to support free thought. Rather than respond with facts or insight, Whoopi leaned heavily on sarcasm and mockery, belittling Karoline's age, experience, and credibility in front of a live studio audience. What she expected was for Karoline to retreat, to flinch or soften her approach. What she got instead was a firestorm. With the poise of someone twice her age, Karoline turned Whoopi's derision into ammunition. She mocked the host's outdated rhetoric, painting it as performative and out of touch. The audience, expecting a lighthearted discussion, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The other hosts exchanged wary glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the spectacle play out. Meanwhile, Karoline and Whoopi locked eyes in a verbal standoff, their conversation laced with veiled insults and barely controlled tempers. Whoopi, known for controlling the narrative on her show, found herself interrupted and outmaneuvered at every turn. Karoline refused to wait her turn to speak. She cut in with sharp, unapologetic observations that flipped the power dynamic. The conversation escalated from policy disagreements to personal digs. Whoopi accused Karoline of being nothing more than a mouthpiece for an outdated ideology, while Karoline responded by accusing Whoopi of clinging to relevance through outrage and scripted confrontation. As the camera continued to roll, the audience began to respond. There was no laughter, no applause, only silence, broken occasionally by scattered gasps as the two women exchanged verbal blows. Even the producers, tucked behind the scenes, debated whether to cut to commercial. But there was something magnetic about the clash, something brutally honest that neither side wanted to walk away from. It was no longer about political stances or generational differences. It had become a test of dominance, of presence, of who could outlast and outwit the other without breaking. Karoline leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes as she delivered a line so biting it left Whoopi momentarily speechless. The audience stirred, sensing the tide turning. The balance of power had shifted. What had started as an ambush by a veteran host had turned into a humiliating showcase of her own inability to handle the guest she had clearly underestimated. And as Karoline sat back in her chair, unfazed, it became clear she had come not just to defend herself, but to expose the shallowness of the very platform she had been invited to speak on. Whoopi's expression hardened. She wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The second round was about to begin, and this time gloves were coming off. As the studio lights continued to blaze and the segment stretched far beyond its intended runtime, the energy in the room had completely shifted. Gone was the polished rhythm of a daytime talk show. In its place stood something raw and uncomfortable, a spectacle fueled by pride and animosity. Whoopi, still smarting from Karoline's verbal assault, could no longer disguise her frustration behind theatrical charm. Her next move was far less calculated, driven more by emotion than strategy. She launched into a tirade, attacking Karoline's past affiliations and questioning her moral compass, framing her as someone willing to defend indefensible political figures for the sake of attention. But Karoline, already locked into a state of cool aggression, refused to let the narrative slip away. She responded not with denial, but with a counterattack that struck at the heart of Whoopi's public persona. She called out the inconsistencies. In Whoopi's past stances, the convenient shifts in opinion that always seemed to align with whatever social trend was safest to endorse. The audience, once passive, was now split. Some nodded along with Whoopi's fire, clapping weakly between her interruptions. Others watched Karoline with a mixture of shock and fascination, unused to seeing someone so young challenge someone so established without flinching. Each woman had crossed the line, and neither showed any interest in stepping back. It was no longer a discussion, it was a duel, and Karoline had mastered the art of controlled damage. With each turn, she exposed how Whoopi's attempts at intimidation were hollow. She referenced past moments where the host had silenced dissenting voices on air, framing herself as a gatekeeper of truth while dismissing inconvenient opinions. The most scathing part of it all was how calmly Karoline said it, without raising, her voice without ever appearing rattled. Whoopi, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her retorts were less structured now, increasingly emotional and personal. She accused Karoline of disrespecting women, minorities, and the very legacy that shows like hers had helped to build. Karoline responded not with defensiveness, but with mockery, suggesting that Whoopi had confused cultural impact with infallibility. It was a devastating blow, not because it was loud, but because it was delivered like a surgeon's cut, deep and precise. The co-hosts tried to step in, attempting to steer the conversation towards something safer, but both women ignored them. The camera stayed fixed, the tension unbroken. There was no script anymore, only two figures clashing live in front of millions, each exposing the other with ruthless clarity. And then came the moment that truly shifted everything. Karoline began recounting a particular incident, a controversial moment from Whoopi's past that had long been buried under vague apologies and media spin. She did not just bring it up, she dissected it, placing Whoopi in the uncomfortable position of having to defend something she thought the world had forgotten. The studio audience gasped, and for the first time in years, Whoopi looked unsure of what to say. But Karoline was not done. She tied that moment to a larger pattern, accusing Whoopi of engaging in selective outrage, of weaponizing social causes for clout, while failing to live up to them when it mattered most. It was brutal, not because it was loud, but because it felt unanswerable. Whoopi's legacy, once seen as untouchable, was now being publicly re-examined by someone half her age. And just when it seemed like things might cool down, Whoopi lashed out one final time. Her words were bitter, scathing, and deeply personal. But they didn't land. Karoline smiled, not arrogantly but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already won. The audience could feel it too. There was no recovery from this, not for Whoopi. She had lost control of her show, her narrative, and her authority, all in the span of a single segment. Karoline adjusted her mic, glanced at the flustered production team, and prepared herself for what came next. The audience wasn't just watching a heated exchange. They were witnessing a cultural moment, a power shift playing out in real time. And the most shocking part was, it wasn't over yet. Karoline leaned back in her seat with a calm that unnerved everyone around her. She had weathered the storm, redirected the lightning, and now stood firmly in control. Whoopi, whose voice once dominated the room, was noticeably quieter. Her expression betrayed a mix of disbelief and indignation, as if the very idea of losing control on her own stage had never crossed her mind. The audience, sensing the shift, became more alert, The energy wasn't just tense now. It was electric. The co-hosts tried again to regain momentum, awkwardly pivoting the topic toward lighter ground, but Karoline wasn't interested in playing along. She smoothly ignored their cues and brought the focus right back to the cracks she had exposed in Whoopi's armor. It wasn't about pettiness or gloating. Karoline was methodical. She used Whoopi's recent contradictions in public interviews, pulled specific examples from past shows, and layered them into a narrative that was impossible to refute. She wasn't attacking Whoopi personally anymore. She was deconstructing the pedestal she stood on. What made it worse for Whoopi was that the viewers could see it. Karoline didn't have to shout or raise her voice. She simply outpaced Whoopi in logic, composure, and credibility. Her ability to pull facts under pressure, to remain poised while speaking pointed truths, drew reluctant respect from the crowd. Even those who didn't agree with her politics found themselves struggling to deny her command of the room. The camera occasionally cut to Whoopi's face, and the contrast was startling. Her defiance had turned to visible frustration. Her responses were slower, her sarcasm now read as bitterness. What was supposed to be a platform for challenging a young conservative figure had transformed into a stage where that same figure was challenging the institution itself, and winning. Karoline then did something no one expected. She shifted from offense to reflection, turning the confrontation into something more profound. She spoke about the generational divide in media, how legacy figures often stifled the voices of those coming after them, not because of disagreement, but because of fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of change, fear that the world was moving faster than they were willing to accept. And in that moment, the audience wasn't just watching a clash of egos. They were watching a generational reckoning unfold. Whoopi tried to reframe the discussion, tried to assert her authority by leaning into her history, her awards, her influence. But Karoline was ready for that too. She acknowledged Whoopi's past achievements, even praised them, but then pointed out how dangerous it was to use past success as a shield against present accountability. It landed like a hammer. The audience didn't cheer, but the silence said more than applause ever could. By now, social media had erupted. Clips of the confrontation were already circulating, and viewers at home began to tune in live, sensing they were witnessing something unusual, something raw and unscripted. The producers scrambled to maintain control, but it was futile. The show was no longer theirs. It belonged to the moment, and Karoline had seized it. As the segment neared its scheduled end, Whoopi made one last attempt to close things on her terms. She tried to assert moral superiority, invoking her decades-long commitment to activism and speaking truth to power. But Karoline, in one final sweep, reframed the entire conversation. She positioned herself not as a challenger to Whoopi, but as a challenger to the system that allowed gatekeepers like her to speak unchecked for so long. It was no longer about two women arguing. It was about a shift in power, about the rising voices refusing to stay silent simply because tradition said they should. By the time the segment ended, Karoline stood tall. Whoopi looked drained, her carefully curated poise undone in front of the very audience she once commanded. The hosts barely made eye contact as they cut to commercial, their smiles brittle and forced. And as the cameras faded to black, it was obvious to everyone that something irreversible had just happened. Karoline didn't gloat. She stood, gave a polite nod to the hosts, and walked off stage without a word. But her silence spoke volumes. She hadn't just held her own. She had turned a hostile spotlight into a stage of triumph. Backstage, the air was thick with tension. Production staff whispered frantically into headsets, trying to piece together how a planned 15-minute segment had erupted into a cultural firestorm. Whoopi remained seated long after the cameras stopped rolling, her expression frozen in a mixture of disbelief and quiet rage. She had been through countless interviews and debates throughout her career, but nothing had left her this exposed, this unbalanced. The worst part was knowing that she had not only been challenged, but clearly bested, on her own turf. Meanwhile, Karoline was met with stunned silence as she exited the stage. The crew didn't know whether to offer congratulations or stay out of her path. She carried herself with the same calm composure that had defined the entire exchange, not a trace of smugness, just the quiet awareness that she had made a point no one could ignore. For years, she had been underestimated, painted as a talking head or a political accessory. But in a single live broadcast, she had dismantled that narrative entirely. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. Within an hour, headlines exploded across the internet. Clips were reposted with headlines ranging from praise for Karoline's courage to outrage over Whoopi's handling of the discussion. Some anchors on rival networks struggled to mask their admiration, while others scrambled to defend Whoopi's reputation. But even her most loyal defenders couldn't deny the damage done. This wasn't just about political disagreements. It had become a reckoning of how media gatekeeping worked and who would be allowed to disrupt it. Social media was a battlefield. Viewers who had never heard of Karoline before were now quoting her remarks, dissecting her composure, and calling her performance one of the most decisive moments in recent television. What fascinated them most wasn't that she had disagreed with Whoopi. It was that she had done it so skillfully, without theatrics or whining, and with facts that couldn't be twisted into sound bites. She hadn't just survived a lion's den, she had flipped the entire cage. As the afternoon wore on, talk show pundits debated whether Whoopi would issue a response or try to smooth things over. But deep down, even her team knew the truth. There was no salvaging the segment. Attempts to paint Karoline as disrespectful only served to highlight the double standard that had allowed certain voices to dominate unchallenged for years. And Karoline, aware of how fragile public sentiment could be, stayed silent. She didn't rush to social media. She let the moment speak for itself. By the evening, Karoline had become a symbol of generational defiance. Young commentators praised her for refusing to be boxed in, while older viewers who had grown tired of sanitized television cheered her for bringing authenticity to a place that had long traded on comfort over challenge. Her words had triggered something deeper than political opinion. They had forced a reckoning about who gets to speak and who gets dismissed. As for Whoopi, the damage lingered. While she returned to the show days later, her aura had changed. The confidence, the easy authority, the ability to control a room with a smirk. It had all been chipped away. The memory of that segment, of being held accountable in front of millions by someone half her age, left a permanent mark. There were murmurs behind the scenes, quiet questions about whether her grip on the show had finally begun to loosen. Karoline, on the other hand, found her calendar suddenly full. Invitations flooded in. Some from networks hoping to ride the wave of her newfound influence. Others from media figures who had once ignored her. But Karoline remained selective. She wasn't interested in becoming a spectacle or milking the moment. What mattered to her was impact. She had made her case, not with volume but with truth, and now that the door had been forced open, she had no intention of letting it close again. By the end of the week, a new narrative had settled into the cultural bloodstream. It wasn't just that Karoline had mocked Whoopi. It was that she had forced the world to watch what happens when legacy power meets someone who refuses to bow to it. And in doing so, she had become something rare in a media landscape built on pretense, unapologetically real. The segment would go down in television history, not because of how loud it was, but because of how clear it made everything. In that moment, one voice stood out, not for being the most famous or the most rehearsed, but for being the one that refused to be silenced. And that, more than anything, was what made it a triumph.